Welcome to Crossroads, a show by the Epoch Times, one of America's largest independent newspapers that brings you insights all beyond the headlines. Now make sure to hit the like button, leave a comment, don't forget to subscribe to get updates on when the next show is. Well, look, what's happening now, the banking system, they're being accused of discriminating against conservatives and against crypto companies. Now, this is not a new debate. You might have heard it when, for example, Donald Trump himself was being canceled by the banks before he became president. But what this is about debanking. Trump is now allegedly preparing actions to prevent this practice from continuing. And this is according to a draft executive order seen by the Wall Street Journal, which they say could be signed this week. Here's what they say. The White House is preparing to step up pressure against big banks over perceived discrimination against conservatives and crypto companies with an executive order that threatens to fine lenders that drop customers for political reasons. Now, note this. It says a draft of the executive order, which was viewed by the Wall Street Journal, directs bank regulators to investigate whether any financial institutions might have violated the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, antitrust laws, or consumer financial protection laws. And it notes that violators could be subject to monetary penalties, consent decrees, or other disciplinary measures according to the draft. Now notes as well, the draft order does not name any specific banks, but appears to refer to an instance where Bank of America was accused of shutting down the accounts of a Christian organization operating in Uganda based on the organization's religious beliefs. The bank has said it closed the accounts because it doesn't serve small businesses operating outside the U.S. It notes as well, the draft order also criticizes the role that some banks played in an investigation into the January 6, 2021 riots, it says, at the U.S. Capitol. Because as you might remember, the banks were actually tracking people's credit card payments and then reported that to the authorities, and people's credit card purchases were used to determine who was actually there that day. Meaning the banks were basically telling on people using a very blanket method of just who was even making purchases in Washington, D.C. Now, how does this all happen? What's going on with it? What are the laws on it? Well, the America First Policy Institute, they have some details on kind of the problems with the laws. Here's what they say. They note that in 2011, federal regulators began issuing informal guidance encouraging banks to consider reputational risks associated with their current and prospective clients. Remember, this would be Obama administration, right? 2011. Now, note that what are these reputation risks? Reputation risk is the risk arising from negative public opinion. So, if the public has a negative opinion of a certain risk, meaning your political views, your stances, maybe your religious views, again, your values of what you approve of or disapprove of. If it damages the reputation of a company or a bank, they might take that into account. And notice that subjectivity, because it's not really written in stone, it's subjective, right, gives regulators great latitude. That in turn allows regulators bias against certain industries, such as a gun manufacturer, or cryptocurrency firms, or J6ers, for example. It says to grade those industries as too risky, warning banks against doing business with them. So if a bank says, you know what, you are too much of a risk, they cancel your account, they debank you. And given the fact that you can't really do business without a bank, the banks have the ability to destroy you. And notes this. Neither the Constitution nor any congressional statute grants powers to the regulators to decide which lawful businesses deserve access to banking services. And yet, through vague terms like reputational risk and the implicit threat of audit or enforcement action, regulators have coerced financial institutions into becoming the enforcement arm of an ideological agenda. And that's important also because what they're saying this is all about really is ideology. That there's a certain, let's say, politically correct narrative that is deemed to be what is in terms of public opinion acceptable. And if you deviate from that accepted public opinion, you can be deemed a reputational risk. And we've seen how that works. We've seen, for example, many conservative organizations getting their bank accounts canceled for political opinion or political speech. We've seen many instances where people's religious beliefs, if they disapprove of some kind of social trend, they do risk losing their banking accounts. This has happened many times. Trump himself was targeted by this, alongside some of the legal attacks with them leading up to the 2024 elections. And I think because of that, he's taken it pretty seriously. But it continues here stating, banking creates uncertainty and hardship. Debanking. And it says, in a nation governed by laws, the practice of legal coercion through regulatory discretion is antithetical to the American system of justice. Ultimately, debanking is not just an economic problem, but a constitutional one. When federal officials use unofficial guidance to achieve what Congress never authorized, they violate both the spirit and the letter of the law. It says the solution is to excise power from the regulators, and that begins with narrowing their discretion. So what they're saying here basically, the problem of debanking is not just a banking issue, it's a regulatory issue. The system itself has given banks the ability of using their own kind of viewpoints to determine what represents a risk. And unfortunately, risk is no longer just financial risk, risk is reputational risk. And what constitutes a risk to reputation? Well, whatever is considered controversial or acceptable socially. Who determines that? Well, mostly political narratives and whatever the media is saying. Now look, the issue of debanking, it's not even just being raised by Trump right now. This is a broader campaign being rolled out. Congress is discussing the issue. In particular, the Senate Banking Committee Chairman, Tim Scott, a Republican from South Carolina, he also spoke with Fox News Digital about this. Watch.
This is a financial swamp in D.C. and beyond that decides who gets an account, who gets a loan, who has access. These are folks who have not been elected by the citizens of our country. These are the bureaucrats who are using their power to weaponize it against consistently Republicans, consistently against conservatives, and consistently against growth industries of our country, like the crypto industry, because they just don't like them. I'm not sure if they'll.
Now, Senator Tim Scott brings up an interesting point that parts of this problem is that, to some degree, it's in the hands of regulators, the financial swamp, as he refers to it. And here's more context on that from Fox Business. They say this: banking regulators operate under an alphabet soup of federal agencies. And sources on Wall Street told Fox News that when a regulator speaks, whether couched as a rule, guidance, or even a simple conversation, banks have little choice but to listen, suggesting they're being puppeteered to do things that the government can't legally do. And so rather than do it illegally, they go through private institutions to do it for them. It says the high level of power that regulators hold was first crafted under Operation Choke Point by former President Barack Obama's Department of Justice. A key component of the operation allowed regulators to flag bank accounts that posed a reputational risk to banking institutions. It notes that additionally, language in the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency Handbook alluded to treating negative public opinion as heavily as a serious financial risk. And who dictates public opinion? Well, the media and political narrative. Now, like in other news, though, President Donald Trump also wants harsher punishments for underage criminals. And this also comes after a former Doge employee was severely beaten in Washington, D.C. We're talking more about this after a quick break.
All right, just to pause here for a super quick moment. You are, of course, watching Crossroads with Joshua Philipp. I'm just here to share a message about American Hartford Gold, my own personal gold and silver bullion dealer. Now, obviously, the recent tariffs have made the markets super turbulent and volatile. With every new piece of tariff news, the markets seem to either crash up or crash down. And of course, it's worth mentioning that these conditions don't only affect Wall Street. They affect all of us through our investments and our retirement accounts. That's why I'd like to introduce you to a company that I trust and I myself use to secure my own savings, American Hartford Gold. They specialize in helping Americans move our assets into something tangible, into something you can actually hold, which is physical gold and physical silver, two precious metals that act as a hedge against all those decisions being made in Washington, D.C. They have an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau. They have thousands of 5-star reviews, and they make the whole buying process super simple. Your metals can be shipped directly to your door, or you can transfer your current retirement account to a tax-advantaged gold IRA. And the best part is that right now, American Hartford Gold is offering an exclusive offer. When you call them today and you mention the name Joshua, you could receive up to $15,000 in free silver with your initial investment. Take advantage of their special offer. You can either just call them at 877-260-2764 or text Joshua to 65532. All their information will also be down in the description box below. And now, back to Crossroads.
Welcome back. If you're enjoying the show, please support us by hitting the like button, leave a comment. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel. It helps us get the show out to more people, and you get updates on when this fantastic show is. So please don't forget. Now look, one of the former Doge employees, the man known as Big Balls, many people have heard about him. Well, he apparently lived up to his name, and he was severely beaten in Washington, D.C. because he stepped in to protect a woman who was being carjacked by a group of urban youth. And President Donald Trump is now talking about taking action to bring Washington, D.C. under maybe a stronger form of law and order. This is what Trump said during a briefing on Wednesday. Watch.
By the way, I have to say that somebody from Doge was very badly hurt last night. You saw that. A young man who was beat up by a bunch of thugs in D.C. And either they're going to straighten their act out in the terms of government and in terms of protection, or we're going to have to federalize and run it the way it's supposed to be run.
And it doesn't end there. Trump is talking about a new vision for Washington. This is a post he made on Truth Social. Trump said crime in Washington, D.C. is totally out of control. He said local youths and gang members, some only 14, 15, and 16 years old, are randomly attacking, mugging, maiming, and shooting innocent citizens at the same time knowing that they will be almost immediately released. They are not afraid of law enforcement because they know nothing ever happens to them. But he said but it's going to happen now, meaning they're going to face justice. He says the law in D.C. must be changed to prosecute these minors, quote unquote, as adults and lock them up for a long time, starting at age 14, which is a big deal. Trump is suggesting 14-year-old criminals will be treated as adults, at least in Washington, D.C., if he moves forward with it. But he says the most recent victim was beaten mercilessly by local thugs. Washington, D.C. must be safe, clean, and beautiful for all Americans, and importantly for the world to see. If D.C. doesn't get its act together and quickly, we will have no choice but to take federal control of the city and run this city, Washington, D.C., as it should be run, and put criminals on notice that they're not going to get away with it anymore. Perhaps it should have been done a long time ago. Then this incredible young man and so many others would not have had to go through the horrors of violent crime. If this continues, I'm going to exert my powers to federalize this city. Make America great again. That's what he says, which is a big deal. So with Washington, D.C., it's always been kind of a middle. There are people fighting over the future of Washington, D.C. Democrats, they want Washington, D.C. to have statehood. Part of the reason for that is, while you have a concentration of government employees there, they lean very heavy Democrat. It's a very solid blue city. And if they got statehood, they would, of course, get a new seat in the Senate. They'd, of course, get more representation in the House of Representatives. And Democrats believe that by giving statehood to Washington, D.C., they get more representation. On Trump's side, he's saying, no, that cannot happen, partly because of that. They don't want to give more seats to Democrats in Congress. But Trump is saying that they should actually federalize Washington, D.C., treat the entire city as if it's like basically federal property. Now, that's not something we really have in the United States currently. It would probably be pretty controversial, especially given the fact that you do have people living there. And if they live there without proper representation and they're just part of a federal district, it's kind of weird, to be honest. But Trump is also talking about breaking up Washington, D.C., moving federal agencies to different parts of the United States, trying to break up the concentration of government officials within their own kind of basically echo chamber, right? The ivory tower, and integrating them more into like normal American society with the hopes that they'll become more integrated into, well, normal American society, that he won't have like federal town. And the other problem Trump is pointing to is, of course, well, the lack of law and order. On that front, we'll see what Washington, D.C. does. They might move forward and make some harsher punishments for crimes. Will that include treating children or treating teenagers as adults as young as 14 years old? Just because Trump says they want to do something doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen. It should be noted. There are a lot of people who would challenge that. That would be very controversial, but that's also a bigger problem you have in other parts of the country. In particular in New York City, where youth are not treated as adults, you have gangs oftentimes who recruit, teenagers, 14, even like younger than that, to commit crimes. A lot of the carjackings are done by kids, teenagers. A lot of crime is done by teenagers. When you had groups like, for example, Tren de Aragua, the Latin American gang operating in New York City very heavily, which they still are, they were recruiting teenagers to go and rob people at gunpoint because they knew it's a revolving door, and they don't get treated like real criminals. So how do you solve that problem unless you start treating them as real criminals? And the argument is, well, is it fair? I don't know. Trump seems to believe it is. So we will see moving forward how they actually change this. On a related topic, though, speaking about areas that have these kinds of problems. In California, there are growing concerns that parents could soon have their children more easily taken away from them if a new bill becomes law. And in fact, the Christian community is really warning against this. Christian Post said this. They said a popular California pastor is warning Christians they might have to flee the state of California if lawmakers pass a controversial bill that would allow nearly any adult to take custody of a child without alerting parents. Imagine that. Your kid goes to school one day and there's a change of legal guardian and suddenly your kid is not your kid anymore. That's what they claim is happening, at least. And notes that Pastor Jack Hibbs of Calvary Chapel, Chino Hills warned his congregation last week about Assembly Bill 495, which supporters claim would expand child welfare protections by legally recognizing caregivers and providing children with access to family services without unwanted disruptions. And it's titled the Family Preparedness Plan Act of 2025. The bill would expand the definition of a caregiver. Who is a caregiver? Well, the change would include non-relative extended family members, defined as, well, quote, any adult caregiver who has an established familial or mentoring relationship with a child, or who has an established familial relationship with a relative of the child. It says, in turn, any caregiver would be allowed to take custody of a child by merely handing over a signed affidavit to school or child care staff. All they got to do, say, hey, I'm this kid's mentor. I'm mentoring this child. Here's a signed paper. That kid is now my kid. Now, again, we'll see what this really says. We'll see what comes out from it. This is, of course, part of the accusations against it, but it says here, while AB 495 purports to address unique challenges faced by immigrant families under the Trump administration's mass deportation efforts, Hibbs says the potential threat the bill would pose to child welfare is too serious to ignore. Maybe, for example, it'll be the good old Coyote Bill, who trafficked the child across the border, who says they're his mentor. Maybe the Coyote will say, hey, school, here's the affidavit. The kid is my kid now. Now, note the California Senate Appropriations Committee is set for a hearing on AB 495 on August 18th. And the Christian community, at least part of it, is warning parents about this currently. It comes to what kids are dealing with, because they're kind of being, they have things coming out from every direction. There's also the issue of schools. And one of the nationwide pushes is for school choice. They're talking about it all over the place. Some states have already done it. And this is where parents get some money that would have been spent on public schools, which is a lot of money. And parents they can then use that money for things like private schools or home schools or other educational programs. In other words, they can choose to not use the public school system if they believe it does not give a good enough service, and they can go for whatever they think provides the best service. And there are people saying, well, if people can choose the best service, public schools will go out of business. And we're now seeing this in Arizona. In Arizona, they put this into effect, and they're now seeing that when kids and parents actually have a choice, well, they choose to not go to public schools to such an extent that the public school system is actually shutting down, to a large degree at least. Washington Post said this. They say now, as the new school year begins, the Roosevelt Elementary School District opens with just 13 schools. They begin by explaining the teachers going there and they're very sad. The schools are closing and it's terrible. And now they're opening with just 13 schools. They note that's almost a third fewer than it had last spring. A response to enrollment declines as the state offers unprecedented, it says, unprecedented taxpayer issues with this. It notes that this is funding for alternatives to public schools. Further, it notes that perhaps more than any other state, Arizona has embraced market competition as a central tenet of its K-12 education system, offering parents an extraordinary opportunity to choose and shape their children's education using tax dollars and developing a national reputation as the Wild West of schooling. How dare they have choice? What wild, lawless land this is. It says the state has supported a robust charter school system, tax money for homeschooling, and expansive private school vouchers, which are available to all families regardless of income. And lo and behold, when parents can actually choose, they choose the one they think is best for them, and it's not the public school. And it said empowerment scholarship accounts, a form of voucher, state data show. A second voucher program awarded nearly 62,000 tax-supported private school scholarships in 2024, though some students received more than one. More than 232,000 students attend charter schools. And it notes that together, these programs help explain why just 75% of Arizona school children attended public schools in 2021, the most recent year in which data is available. That's one of the lowest rates in the country. And I would argue a lot has changed since 2021, so I'd imagine that a lot fewer are attending this year. Now, what does this tell us? Well, how does the free market actually work? How is it that market competition is causing some schools to close? The kids are going somewhere. They're not just dropping out. So the question is, where are they going? Where is all the money going? Where are the kids going? Well, the simple answer is this: not to public schools. How does the free market actually work? Well, if you want to compete in a free market and you're not living in a dictatorship or a system where everybody's compelled to buy from you, right? You don't have a monopoly. What happens? When it's an equal playing field and people can choose, they go for the place that offers the best service, the best price, and of course, the best quality. And if they're choosing to not go somewhere to the extent that it goes out of business, it means that their service, their price, and their quality could not compete. Ironically, this is the argument used to defend, against school choice, because many say that what's happening in Arizona could spread across the United States. They're saying kids will suffer. The issue is that kids are not suffering. Kids are going to charter schools and private schools are actually becoming more common, as are charter schools and homeschool. Meaning, of course, that parents are choosing better options for their children, and the better options happen to not be the public school system. The question is, who is it really not nice to? Well, it's not nice to the public school system. The other argument here, of course, is, well, do illegal immigrant children get the money? Do you have to be an American citizen to get the money? That's a big question, because there are a lot of illegal immigrant children who are able to go to the public school system. And if, of course, they're not able to get that money, then they're stuck in what is deemed a less quality system. The other option with all of this is you allow the public schools to have more latitude in terms of how they educate kids. And if they can begin competing on quality, service, and cost, well, people might choose them instead, and the quality of public schools could actually go up. But here's another important question, right? Schools are closing, but in terms of impact on kids and families, Is the quality of education getting better or worse now that they can choose their own schools? And I would say this is the real question you should ask. I would argue that if kids are choosing private schools and homeschool and things like that, I believe that they're choosing what is a better option, and I would imagine the quality for them is higher because of this program. My own personal take, of course. Now, look, on another topic, we were discussing yesterday some of else what's happening right now. Military recruitment commercials, they're changing quite a bit. But let's have a look at it. Let's actually have a look at it ourselves, right? First off, let's have a look at a current military advertisement. This is right now from the Department of Defense. This is earlier this week.
You will feel fatigue. You will feel fear. You will feel happiness. You will feel regret. You will feel sadness. At the end of the day, you will continue to breathe fire. Here's what I tell you to do, and it's almost one of those impossible tasks, but you gotta fight for it every day. You gotta use that operational instinct, and you gotta know what happens before it happens. You gotta stay methodical on the field. You gotta stay clear-headed on the field. You gotta work any resource as required. Kill the enemy, kill the enemy, kill the enemy! You are obligated to protect and serve the Marines on the left and right flank of you 24/7. All come home together. Gonna go. You guys will do the unit proud. You will do your country proud. Don't let fear get in that brain of yours.
What do you think of that? I think it's pretty cool, right? Don't let fear take you. Focus, discipline. A strong focus on killing the enemy. Kind of ruthless, but okay, that's what a military does. And it seems the message there is pretty direct. They're not holding back on what they stand for. Now, let's have a look at what the commercials used to be like. This was not that long ago. This is an Army recruitment video from just 4 years ago, 2021. And it was actually delisted in 2024, but we have the video. Watch.
This is the story of a soldier who operates your nation's Patriot missile defense systems. It begins in California, with a little girl raised by two moms. Although I had a fairly typical childhood, took ballet, played violin, I also marched for equality. I like to think I've been defending freedom from an early age. When I was 6 years old, one of my moms had an accident that left her paralyzed. Doctors said she might never walk again. But she tapped into my family's pride to get back on her feet, eventually standing at the altar to marry my other mom. With such powerful role models, I finished high school at the top of my class, and then attended UC Davis, where I joined a sorority full of other strong women. But as graduation approached, I began feeling like I'd been handed so much in life, a sorority girl stereotype. Sure, I'd spent my life around inspiring women, but what had I really achieved on my own? One of my sorority sisters was studying abroad in Italy. Another was climbing Mount Everest. I needed my own adventures, my own challenge. And after meeting with an Army recruiter, I found it. A way to prove my inner strength and maybe shatter some stereotypes along the way. I'm U.S. Army Corporal Emma Malone Lord, and I answered my calling.
Well, it seems a little different, doesn't it? Makes you wonder, I mean, why would the Army delist that video? Why did they not want to keep it? I don't know. What's your take? Why do you think the Army didn't want to keep that video? I mean, it's a girl with two moms marching for equality, standing up for her family's pride. Good for her. I'm sure she's a nice girl. But it does seem the military is sending a very different message right now than it was 4 years ago. They're representing a very different culture. And I think the other question is, well, what was the effect on troops? If you're trying to recruit people to join the military, what kind of people are you trying to recruit, and do you think that is an effective recruiting message? What we do see currently is this. Military recruitment 4 years ago was so low that they were talking about bringing back the draft. They were talking about involuntary military service. They had to force people to do it because people did not want to join to such a large degree. Now they're actually finding that they cannot even recruit. They have to kind of slow it down. They're reaching their recruiting numbers too quickly. So people are joining. Now, the other issue we have with the United States is we are an all volunteer military, meaning nobody forces you to do it. It does change the culture of the military quite a bit. And the other issue is with public messaging. There's a real question of what kind of culture do you want to represent for the military, right? Who is the military? What kind of image do you want them to really have? Do you want them to be the war fighter? Do you want them to be people out there whose job is to kill the enemy? Or are they out there representing pride and more of like an ideology type thing? What do they actually stand for? What is the purpose of having a military? That is a question. And it does seem the military is going back to more of like an 80s macho kind of image. Good or bad, you tell me. That said, let's jump into some questions. So questions, comments, anything you want to talk about, leave it in the chat. Let's jump into a discussion. And that said, thank you all for being here. If you haven't noticed, I'm not in New York currently. I'm actually in Nebraska, and here doing some interviews and working on the next feature. Quick update on that, by the way. We're putting the last touches on the first feature of what will be many. We're going to be, I mentioned before, Fridays now I'm using it to do features and investigations. These will first be released on Epoch TV. Eventually we're going to release them on YouTube. We'll probably do it under a new YouTube channel. But if you want to watch them when they first start coming out, they'll be on Epoch TV. I'll probably get a few in the bag before we make them on YouTube though. But again, first one should be out not too long. We're putting final touches on it. I'm currently filming the second one. So get ready for some good features again because we're working on that. First question here, Denise B, you're saying, isn't debanking what we do as a nation to terrorists and other world criminals? Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't even think of it like that. Technically, sanctions are a form of debanking. When they sanction somebody, they eliminate their ability to be engaged, in the financial systems. And it's actually very interesting I didn't think of it like this. That's a really good point, Denise. What's interesting with debanking is, it basically has the same effect as being sanctioned. Now, the difference you could argue is that if you get debanked, you're normally not canceled by every bank. Maybe you're canceled by one bank or two banks and you can still use another one. I do know a lot of conservative organizations have been debanked to various degrees. I personally know many people who've been debanked. I personally know some who've been debanked for what does look like ideological reasons, meaning, they're not being sanctioned. It's just the banks doing it. And it's kind of concerning. We talk often about the risk of centralized bank digital currencies, the creation of a social credit system like what they have under the Chinese Communist Party. And what does it look like in China? If you don't toe the party line, if you don't march in lockstep with the communist leaders, well, they cancel you. You can't use the banking system. And because they have digital currency, what do you do? Everything you buy is digital currency. Groceries, the rent for your house, the ability to get loans. If you get debanked in China, you're homeless. And a lot of people are dealing with that. You get debanked in China, You can't buy a home, you can't rent an apartment, you can't buy food, you're going to be begging on the street, and you can't even beg for money because people can't give you cash because everything is digital. That's the concern. In the United States, we're not that far along yet, but unfortunately, we do have private institutions that act like governments. We have private institutions that have monopolies on industries, and they use those monopolies for what are, in fact, partisan, politically motivated reasons. And, I'd say the censorship cartel works like that. The banking cartel works like that. And the big issue that's being raised by Trump and the Republicans right now is that some of the ability they've had in doing this, whether it's censorship, well, it's all, even debanking is censorship, I'd say. The enforcement of a politically correct narrative, meaning if you align with whatever the partisan issue is, look, it used to be Democrats, maybe the Republicans next, that if you don't align with it, you get canceled. A lot of that is kind of a hand in glove type thing where the government can't do it, but private institutions can. And so what's been happening is regulators go to the private institution and tell them to do it, thereby violating constitutional rights through underhanded means. And yeah, Denise B, it is very much like an unofficial form of sanctioning. Actually, it's a good way to put it. God is my joy. You're saying, what is the mechanism by which banks debank someone? What happens to the money? Is it transferred, absorbed, something else? Seems like a great opportunity for a parallel economy to pick up. I'll be honest, so I've read about it, I've watched some videos on it. The entire technical process is a little bit over my head. I know that Joe Rogan, I watched it, he had a very good interview where he brought an expert on, and it was like 2 hours or something like that, talking about how this whole thing works. From what I understand, it is this, right? My basic understanding of the technical process, the banks can just cancel your account. And I don't know what happens to the money when they cancel it. The problem we have with banks is, if they lose your money, you can kind of get some of it back, but you can't always. The banks are always a bit of a gamble. There are some ways that are like financial protections, not always. Banks have a lot of power. Banks have a lot of power. And banks, to an extent, if you understand the credit system and the ability of banks to deny loans, or the ability of centralized banks to establish interest rates, or the ability of centralized banks to print currency and things like that, banks have a lot of power. Now, many people have argued whether they should be given so much power. I should note that the banking and financial systems for a lot of human history have existed outside of the control of normal government. And if you go back and read even stories from ancient Rome and ancient Greece, they were raising the same issues. Debt traps, money magic techniques. Even, for example, sometimes you would have maybe a general wants to become the emperor. They would start printing their own currency with their new face on it and maybe have a few slogans or something like that. The use of money, the use of Tinder, the use of currency to even create political campaigns has always existed. And the ability of people to create banking systems for loans and for, I don't call it investment. In the past, it might have been a little different. Has always been there. And the ability of people to have predatory interest rates has always been there. Ancient Greece had these problems. Ancient Rome had these problems. In fact, some people even attribute the debt problem to be one of the causes of the fall of the Roman Empire. Even ancient China had these problems. The people who create interest rates and who use this to strangle out the population, they tend to do this kind of things. It has always been a problem. Always. Some societies have tried getting around that by outlawing it. One of the reasons why Christians, they don't do it these days, but usury used to be banned under Christianity. These days they do it. Usury is still banned, I believe, by Islam. Many religions don't ban it at all. So it's one of those funny things. But it's kind of viewed as a way of abusing somebody through the monetary system, of enslaving people through the monetary system. And when you give too much power to a monetary system, which is given the power effectively of a cartel or of like a mini government, you can then allow them to become a greater force than the government itself. I would note this is one of the reasons why many of the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson especially, were very much against the idea of the establishment of a centralized bank. They were very, very against it. Many of the founding fathers were very, very against it because they did not want these sons of the American people to become slaves of the banking system. In particular, they had the founding fathers had a lot of criticism against the Bank of England, in particular. And they didn't want the sons and daughters of the United States to become enslaved under the Bank of England, right? The way they talked about it. We didn't learn anything apparently though, because in the early 1900s we folded and we've fallen into the same trap as all the other Western empires. Lo and behold. Let's see, David Anderson, you're saying, yes, the banks can make or break people and businesses, but who gave them that power to begin with? If your guess is government, then you'd be correct. Yeah, I mean, banking has its benefits, right? There's a reason why banking exists. Banking allows you, one, to protect your wealth. You take your money and you say, okay, if I get robbed tomorrow, if a guy breaks into my house and they find, my wads of cash hidden under the floorboards, all my money's gone. You know what I mean? Like if your way of saving money is to like put it in like, I don't know, coffee tins and bury it in the backyard like a pirate. I've known people who've done, I know people like that. It's not that secure. You might have trouble finding it one day. You might forget about it. Maybe it'll rain heavily and destroy it. Maybe somebody will see you doing it and dig it up and steal it. There are some people who try, in ancient societies, some people, quote unquote, wore their wealth. Jewelry was the gold you owned. It was the jewels you owned. Your investments were the decorations you wore on your body. That was part of it. But the reason we created banks partly was to protect your wealth from theft. Now, the problem you have with that, of course, is that sometimes when you have all the money in one place, well, you get what are called bank robbers. And bank robbers know all the money's located in one place and they steal it. And so that was, of course, a problem we had with that. And so you had larger banking organizations get set up where the bank is decentralized. The bank is in Omaha, the bank is in New York, the bank is in, I don't know, Florida or something like that. And so if one of them gets robbed, it doesn't take all your money. The bank can replace it through other means. Banks, of course, are also involved in investment, one of the ways that they grow wealth. And of course, it used to be the case that, before you had fractional reserve banking, right? We have basically the ability of banks to create wealth and things like that. You also had the problem that, how should I say it? Banks took a risk upon themselves and upon you when they invested your money. And if they made investments that were too risky, they risked losing your money. And that did happen. If a bank made investments and their investments went belly up, maybe the economy fails, all of your money's gone. Just like that, poof, overnight. And so, of course, there were systems put in place to try to protect your wealth from that. One of the systems in place was to limit how much money a bank could actually invest of the money they held. One of the problems, notably, when you have what are called runs on the bank, where everybody says, okay, I'm going to get my money out of the bank, and the bank very quickly says, we don't have your money, we invested all of it, because the bank doesn't always hold the money. They put the money into assets, real estate, stocks, things like that. Crypto, I guess, these days, which I don't like personally, but they do that. And then, of course, there's the other problem that centralized banks, state banks, government banks, they're also able to set interest rates. And, to an extent, they could set interest rates on loans, even when not run by the government. You go to the bank and they say, all right, 10% interest rate. It's good for you. Maybe 10% is an exaggeration. Some of them charge a lot. But what that means is that oftentimes, rather than even paying off your debt, you're just paying the interest on debt, and you effectively become a slave. When a chunk of your income is taken from you by a third party, you are a slave. You can be a slave to a small degree, or you can be a slave to a large degree. If the majority of your income is taken just to pay interest or to pay off a debt, you are a debt slave. You are a slave to debt. And unfortunately, because some people don't really understand the way that loans work or interest, they do it to kids and going to college and stuff like that. A lot of people don't know what they're getting themselves into, especially in older societies where math and education was not. When people didn't have as good of an education system, you could very easily fool people into taking on predatory loans. I don't know if we're much better these days. You look at how many people get into predatory loans, especially with the credit card system and things like that, but it's a problem. There used to be caps on the amount of interest organizations could charge. Some cultures, some religions forbid it almost entirely. Some allow it. Some allow it only against other religions, but not against people of their own. Every religion has a different take on usury or predatory loans, right? Again, Christians used to forbid it, but these days, I think people, I don't know, they just don't practice. I don't know why they don't practice it these days. But it used to be against the religion. On another point with this, the big change we had in the United States was the creation of the Federal Reserve, which is kind of private, federal to an extent where, there's some federal oversight. But the Federal Reserve is able to set interest rates. The Federal Reserve is able to bail out banks. Banks are able to make much more risky investments. You could say that's great for economic growth. It's great for the protection of your money, but it's also allowed to print tinder, to issue tinder and print currency, which leads to inflation. So they can double, triple the amount of money in circulation. And they use that as a way to kind of, maintain the value of the currency as a stable currency, and also to bail out the banks at the cost of pretending that your money is still worth the same it used to be. Very controversial things, but of course, that is the issue of banking. And you could also argue on the plus side of banking, the ability to have investment and the ability to get loans. It allows you to do things you probably cannot afford to do otherwise. You can take out a business loan and you can start a business. If it was not for a banking system, you would not be able to do that. There are many benefits to the banking system. I use the banks. You know what I mean? The question for, again, actually a lot of human civilization, going back again to ancient Rome and ancient Greece, has always been, how do you manage that in a way that is fair to people? And how do you regulate it in a way that it does not take advantage of people? I don't think we've solved that problem yet. Alfred's mom, you say federalizing DC makes sense. Yeah. I don't know how that's going to work, but it is interesting. Okay, so Washington, D.C., of course, being the capital city of it's the U.S. capital. The question has always been, how do you have a U.S. capital and not have it become like some weird partisan hotbed? I don't know. Is it good to have a concentration of government agencies in one location? Well, it does. Like, why do you have an office building, right? You have an office building so the workers in your company can all come together. They know each other. They can work together more easily. The problem you have when you have different agencies and branches of government that are supposed to be kind of separate, all in one single place, you tend to have the risk of underhanded deals, of factions being formed, of clubs, and that kind of thing. Some people think that actually helps the U.S. government. If you ever go to Washington, D.C., Washington, D.C. is a tribal city. It's tribes. You have little tribes all over the place. Some of these are PACs, right? Political action committees. Some of them are activist organizations. Some of them are clubs, and I'm not talking about the creepy ones, just normal clubs. Washington, D.C. is a tribalist city. I like it, actually. We have an office in Washington, and, I like going to the, some of the different, like Christmas parties and things like that. It's a tribal city. And like any tribes, they fight for their interests. They try to create alliances. There's almost like a chess game that takes place in Washington. Now, some people have questioned whether that's the way that the government should work. And Trump, I think, is proposing a very different option. He wants to try to break that up. He says it's created what's called the swamp, where they've created little clubs and you're not in it, as George Carlin would say. It's one big club and you ain't in it, right? Great comedian, by the way. Trump wants to break that up, and he wants to take the federal agencies and move them. So the club they will have is with the local community of the United States. Rather than being part of a ivory tower type club, they'll be hanging out at the local pub with Joe the plumber and Bill the roofer. You know what I mean? And those are my kind of people too. So I don't know. Is that better? Is that worse? The other problem you have, of course, is that Washington, D.C. does very much have a crime problem. And it's kind of weird because you go around there, it's hot out, it's like a swamp, and you're sweating, and everybody's dressed in suits and super well dressed. And then you have very, very poor areas where crime is very, very bad. And it's kind of a bizarre contrast when you get into there. Some people, including Republicans, are questioning, is that a good image for the capital of the United States? I don't know about that. And so they're saying, well, the capital of the United States should be the example of the United States. Proper law and order, maybe showing what government does to better the lives of the people of a city or state. You could argue you have a very strong welfare system. Does the welfare system lead to a better outcome or a worse outcome? Has the war on poverty created better lives for people, or is it just institutionalized poverty? Depending on which side of the aisle you're on, you can have very different narratives with this, right? But I do think we can all objectively say, no, the war on poverty has not resulted in lower poverty. It has resulted in institutionalized poverty. And so what is the solution to that? Light on crime policies, or do you treat it seriously? It's a balance, of course. I've said this before, that my personal interpretation of the right and left wings in the United States, liberal or conservative, I would define it as leniency and strictness. Conservatives lean more towards a very strict form of rule of law. Democrats lean more towards a very lenient form of rule of law. And I think because as the society's become more polarized, they've gone to more extremes. Democrats have advocated for very, very lenient, defund the police, legalize theft under $998 like in California. Yeah, they changed that, but they're not. They actually came out recently. They're not going to even pass some of the laws to fund those moves. And so you have kind of legalized crime on one side. On the other side, Republicans haven't gone too far with it yet, but there was not a time too long ago where if you had a marijuana seed, you can go to jail for life. So, is that the type of strictness you want? In my personal take, proper rule of law is somewhere in the middle. And but I also believe that the government should recognize social trends. If you have a trend where gangs are recruiting 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds to murder people or beat people or steal cars, you need to have a way to deal with that. Because once they find that they're not going to face punishment, some people are not going to stop at any evil. Rule of law has two sides to it. Rule of law has a type of external pressure, the threat of consequence. Rule of law also has an internal side to it, which is, human morality, internal restraint. And unfortunately, when people lack internal restraint, the only thing that restrains them is external restraint. And so if you don't have a proper threat of consequence, some people will stop at no evil. They will do everything up to the extent that they believe they'll face consequences. And if you eliminate consequences, while most of us would not do anything terrible, there are many people who would. And unless you improve the moral society, you're not going to fix that, right? Unless you, of course, have a strong system of justice. Let's see. Realityisreal.com. What politically correct is depends entirely upon the political viewpoint or to whom it is being referred. Just stating the phrase without said reference renders it meaningless, as it would be impossible to determine what the viewpoint is. Yeah. So what is political correctness? In the United States, we've come to a very, we've come to a very partisan understanding of it, because mostly it is the left wing in the United States that talks about, political correctness, other than Republicans criticizing it. What is political correctness? Political correctness, as opposed to, let's say, social norm, it is what is deemed as correct in terms of political agenda. Political correctness goes back actually to 1967 during the Cultural Revolution in China. It was actually started by Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong, the former head of the Chinese Communist Party. And basically he said this: if you follow what the party says, you are politically correct. If you go against what the party says, you are not politically correct, and you will be beaten, imprisoned, or killed. What was politically correct in China in 1967? Well, killing your teacher, killing your landlord. If you were a woman and you wore makeup, you could be deemed a rightist, and you could be, beaten or whatever. If you had flowers in front of your house in your yard, you could be called a rightist, and you could be beaten. If you didn't destroy the four old habits like customs and morality and stuff like that, you could be deemed not politically correct. If you did not believe in destroying, the four olds, it was old beliefs, religion, old customs and habits, and old culture and stuff like that. So, they were destroying temples, they were destroying artifacts, they were destroying basically the heritage and the culture that defined China. That was politically correct, because it was a moral system based on political action. Now, what is the basis of political correctness? It is government action. And I've actually heard Chinese people talk about this. It's an interesting take on why communism tries to destroy religion. When you believe in religion, you believe in an unchanging moral standard. You believe there are certain things that are good and certain things that are evil, and these do not change no matter how the society changes, no matter how the culture changes. It is an anchored, steady moral system. Don't kill, don't steal, don't cheat, don't, there's certain values that underpin your interpretation of good and evil. Now, if you're a tyrannical government that wants to have people kill certain people, maybe the kulaks, or the Nazis killed the Jews, or the gypsies, or China wanted to kill the landlords and things like that. The traditional morality would impede that effort. People would say, what you're doing is evil, we're not going to go with it, because religion tells us what you're doing is evil. If the Communist Party says, we need you to go and steal the money from the landlord because the money has been taken through underhanded means. They have an unfair hold on wealth. A narrative almost every communist state has used. From Vladimir Lenin to the current communists who talk about the 1%, right? It's the same exact narrative. Well, traditional morality would tell you that stealing is wrong. So you would say, what you're doing is evil. What you're preaching is evil. What you're trying to get me to do is evil. So communism, the enemy of political correctness, is traditional morality. They need to destroy this, because what they want is this. What has been explained to me in terms of what the CCP is and how it operates is good and evil, morality or immorality. What defines it under true political correctness? Government action. What the party does is always right. If the party says killing is right, then killing is right. If the party says stealing is right, stealing is right. If the party says that destroying this group of people is right, then destroying that group of people is right. And if you're politically correct, you go along with it. If you're not politically correct, you resist it and they kill you. And that's truly what political correctness is. Now, I would say on the other side of this, and this is the way it often gets confused, societies also have social norms outside of religion. In the United States, we have mannerisms. You eat with your mouth closed. If you leave a building, you hold the door open. Maybe you let the lady sit first. If you're in a bus and a pregnant woman is standing up, you probably give her your seat. You know what I mean? You let the elderly take your seat. We have certain social norms that represent what a polite society is. We have certain social norms of what we expect from people to become socially acceptable. If some dirtbag hits on your daughter, you might beat him up. You know what I mean? Because again, it's not like enforced by religion, but it's enforced by our cultural standards of what we view as right and wrong. Every society has different standards on the social level of what is deemed socially acceptable or socially unacceptable. And so, and I would also argue, some religions of the Catholic Church, they also maintain some degree of what they call political correctness. But I think these days the terms are used in ways where people have different intentions on how they're using the words. I believe the way that they actually mean it is that they represent a type of generosity and a belief in helping the poor and helping the downtrodden and caring for the sick and that kind of thing, which should not be concerned with communist political correctness. The belief, in other words, they also have the belief in what it means to be a good person that goes beyond. Let's use Christianity, for example. The 10 Commandments represent what is forbidden, but social kindness represents what it means to be a good person. So, the Catholic Church, they might run orphanages, they might run food drives, they might run things like that are not required by the religion, but are deemed to be what a kind-hearted person would do. And so, modern society, we confuse these things because political correctness is often misunderstood as being social correctness or social morality. And I think over time, what some people have tried to do is try to integrate political correctness into the cultural framework of the society. For the most part, I believe that war has been lost. You can look at Hollywood. What films are being rejected? What films are being accepted? You can look at mass entertainment. What types of images and narratives are being rejected? What do people not want? If a business makes a commercial, what is accepted and what is rejected? We can see that what was deemed politically correct is being heavily rejected. Some people want it, but look at the stocks. And in terms of how the market reacts, the market is not an isolated entity. The market reflects what is desired by the public. And overwhelmingly, it rejects that stuff. Look at what succeeds. The things that are criticized as not being politically correct. And so I do think they've failed to integrate that into the culture, which I believe was part of the agenda with it. Let's see, question. Moldy Guard, you're saying the system needs to make sense. C-E-N-T-S, not sense. Yeah. I believe you're talking about the monetary system. Well, and that's also the issue too, is that a good monetary system for a country should expand its wealth. The question is, how do you expand the wealth while also expanding the wealth of the individual? And I would actually say this was one of the major miscalculations for a lot of the establishment in the 2024 elections. Because what did we see? All right. What was the state of the economy in 2023 and 2022 leading up to the 2024 elections? What was the state of the economy? Was the stock market doing well or doing poorly? How strong was the US dollar? It was actually doing okay. Now, we were being told different narratives. We were being told we were heading into a state of stagflation, the risks of that. That was the narrative of why the Federal Reserve created very high interest rates, which they're maintaining despite everything. In spite of everything, I should say. Right? That was the narrative. But if you looked at the stock market, from COVID-19 and the lockdowns, the stock market went like this. The markets were doing fantastic. Now, the question is, while the markets were doing fantastic, was the experience of the average person in line with that? The simple answer is no. Because what happened with COVID-19? Well, there were lockdowns, there were economic shutdowns. Who benefited from that and who suffered from it? Well, the people who benefited from it were mostly the public traded companies. Walmart, Kmart, Amazon, the companies that had online shipping and those things, because everything went digital, right? Who suffered from that? Well, the local bakery down the street, who had to shutter their doors because they were not deemed an essential service. The local bookstore, who had to close because they were not deemed an essential service, and Amazon basically took over the entire market. It was your local mom and pop shops. It was even a lot of the mid-sized businesses that were not publicly listed. So in other words, what it did was it transferred the wealth by transferring the customers from all the smaller businesses to all the publicly listed, corporate businesses. And so how did that look on the surface? Well, you saw the stock market go like this, and people just looking at that as the kind of heartbeat of, the social welfare of the society, they might have said, fantastic, economy's doing great. You're all a bunch of conspiracy theorists if you say otherwise. And that was the narrative a lot of the media was saying, as you might remember. But on the other hand, you had a lot of people saying, look, I can barely afford to live. I lost my job. It was cheaper to get the government stipend every month than it was to work a full-time job. And, a lot of people suffered. And then, Americans were being squeezed in multiple directions. H-1B visas are taking all the cushy jobs. Your IT jobs, your white-collar jobs, a lot of it's going to overseas jobs, H-1B visas. Look at Microsoft, look at Disney, look at the big companies that provide the good jobs that people kind of want. H-1B visas were eating all of that up. Where do you go? Well, you go to the blue-collar jobs, right? You learn a trade. All that was being eaten up by a lot of people coming from Latin America, illegal immigration, where they were taking those jobs. And you're competing with people making bids so low that you're going out of business. I know a lot of guys who worked in construction were going out of business. And then you deal with, well, what are the lowest tier jobs? Well, geez, guess I'll go work at McDonald's. I like McDonald's, by the way. I have nothing against them. But, in terms of it used to be the student job. If you were in high school, you worked there. If you were in college, maybe you worked there. It was deemed an entry-level job, not a career, unless you wanted to become like a manager or something like that, or you wanted to start your own. It was not supposed to be like a career unless you went the path of management. But even those jobs now were taken up by illegal immigrants. And so Americans, they were being squeezed from every direction. All the major employers pushed you out of the system. And unless you wanted to go get a government job or maybe join the military, and even there, political narratives are squeezing you, it was very hard to get by. And I believe that was the phenomenon, or I believe that was kind of the petri dish, so to speak, that actually led many people to vote for Trump. And I think that was the part that was totally miscalculated by people who are only watching the markets. The market does not always reflect the interests of the individual. And I think people who just look at the numbers, you can very easily miss the context. A problem overall, by the way, with statistics. Statistics don't show you context. And it does often lead to miscalculations when people are disconnected from human experience. All right, everyone, that said, Again, I'm on the road right now. I actually got to go do an interview in a bit, so I got to end the show now. That said, let me know what you think in the chat. I mean, I don't know. There's a lot to talk about. What do you think about federalizing Washington, D.C.? Do you think it's terrible? Do you think it's a good thing? Do you think it's going to eliminate the federal, the government representation of the people who do live there? I don't know. You tell me. What about your experience during COVID-19? Was your life fantastic? Were you rolling in money? Were you diving into the gold things like Scrooge McDuck? Or were you struggling to get by? What was your personal experience? I'm curious on whether the markets reflected your own experience. Let me know in the chat. That said, folks, I'll be back again on Monday, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. In the meantime, please do not forget to like this video. And if you're new here, please subscribe. We do a lot of great shows. I'll see you again on Monday. In the meantime, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.